MLK was, of course, one of the most powerful speakers ever, and his speeches are incredibly rhetorically profound. From the perspective of language, it's also equally interesting, although not nearly as studied, as to how he situates himself as an African American, as a Southerner, as a resident of the urban South, and as a preacher. So the particular use of features, his R's, his T's, and so forth, are really very reflective of who he is, what his status is, and how he reflects that status in his speech. For example, in words like better, the R there, Southerners historically were R-less. Martin Luther King is often R-less. His T's in better, where the usual American would pronounce them with a flap like better, he would say better. And sometimes when he would use his R's homiletically, he would roll them. So he would say better than, and that's a preacher style. At the same time, when the R is absent, it's reflective of Southern African American, as is the T, which is similar to example of how Barack Obama articulates his T's. So it's a forceful style that is often characteristics of politicians, orators, and influential speakers, and it seems to be a little more pronounced among African Americans who are in political office or who have cultural capital. Listen to this.
You honor the ground crew, without whose labor and sacrifice the jet flights to freedom could never have left the earth. Most of these people will never make the headlines, and their names will never appear in Who's Who.
So you notice how he says appear, and he says appear, and really articulates the P. And then in the Who's Who. But you hear sort of how he uses a preacher kind of R, where he says river of life as opposed to river or river, and sometimes he will say river. But it's really interesting the way in which he manipulates these things as he's talking to his audience, as he performs a preaching style, and the authority that emanates from that preaching style.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
He would be most rhetorical with the African American audiences. And so he would be most comfortable and use that rhetorical style. To some extent, he uses it with all audiences. So he uses it with the Oslo audience where he accepted the Nobel Prize, and he also uses it to some extent. But when you look at the incidents, you notice he uses it much more in a comfortable preaching situation of an African American audience. They expect it, they're used to it, they respond to it, and in a sense, all of these little details are part of the effective interaction that even his pauses for reactions from the audience are very significant, and that he allows them to give their response to his call in his preaching style.
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
It's really a remarkable display of how people use tiny dialect features to portray who they are, what their situation is, and how they're communicating with his audience. And no one was better than him.